Grace Mitchell stood at the observation window of the orbital station and stared at the planet below. Kethis was not beautiful. The surface was dark gray and brown, twisted with rock formations that looked like broken bones. Storms moved across the atmosphere in thick, violent patterns. Lightning cracked between clouds in colors that were not natural. No other human was standing with her. They were all busy preparing her equipment, or they were avoiding her. She was not sure which. The mission briefing had been short and direct. The Galactic Council had decided that planet Kethis was unlivable. Too many expedition attempts had failed. 3 different alien species had sent teams to study the planet. All of them had reported the same conclusion. The atmosphere was toxic, the soil was poison, and the creatures that lived there were mindless predators that killed anything that moved. The Council wanted one final attempt before they gave up completely. They wanted a human. Not because they believed a human could succeed, but because they had nothing left to lose. Grace was a botanist. She had spent 20 years studying how plants grew in harsh environments. She had worked on colony worlds, on artificial stations, and in underground bunkers. When the Council offered her this assignment, she had accepted in less than 10 minutes. Her supervisor had tried to stop her. He said she was throwing her life away. Grace had smiled and packed her equipment anyway. She was 53 years old. She had no family waiting for her anywhere. She had no reason not to try. Captain David Walsh brought the landing shuttle down with steady hands. He had flown Grace through 2 wars and 4 major disasters. He did not speak much on the descent. The shuttle shook as it entered the atmosphere of Kethis. The windows filled with red and orange light. Grace held her seat and watched the planet come closer. The landing zone was a flat area of rock surrounded by jagged formations. Walsh set the shuttle down carefully and turned to look at Grace. "You have 6 months of supplies," he said. "The next supply run will come in 4 months. If you want to leave before that, you can call us. We will come get you." Grace nodded. She knew he did not expect her to ask for rescue. The habitat dome arrived in pieces. 3 workers assembled it while Grace watched. It was small, only big enough for one person to live and work in. The dome had everything she needed: water recyclers, air processors, storage for equipment, and a small garden module. The workers did not stay long. They left her with a basic medical kit, food rations, and communication equipment. "Good luck," one of them said. He did not look like he meant it. Grace waited until the shuttle left the ground before she stepped outside the dome for the first time. The air was breathable with her mask on, but it tasted like metal and smoke. The ground under her feet was hard and rough. Temperature readings on her suit showed it was cold, much colder than the briefing had suggested. She walked out from the dome and surveyed the area. The twisted rock formations created natural barriers all around her landing site. In the distance, she could see movement. Large shapes moving across the landscape. The briefing files had called them Kethis predators. The images were unclear, but the shapes suggested creatures that were bigger than anything on Earth. Much bigger. Grace spent the first week inside the dome, running tests on the soil, the water, and the atmosphere. The soil samples were strange. The mineral content was unusual, but it was not poison. The briefing had been wrong about that. Or the other teams had tested only surface soil. Grace took samples from deeper down. The composition changed. It improved. The deeper samples looked almost like Earth soil, just with different mineral ratios. The water was clean when filtered. The atmosphere, while not breathable without a mask, was not actively toxic to human lungs in short exposures. Grace made notes. She documented everything. The Council had been wrong about multiple things. On the 8th day, Grace began her first experiment. She planted seeds and prepared soil inside the dome. earth wheat, earth corn, earth beans. She added the mineral combinations she had found in the deeper soil samples. She added water filtered from the local streams. She set up light systems and waited till the creatures came closer on day 10. Grace watched them from inside the dome. One was enormous, with scales that reflected the dim light of Kethis. Its head was almost as big as her entire body. It moved on 4 massive legs. When it breathed, she could see the air moving. It stopped near the dome and seemed to look at her. Grace did not move. She did not run. She just watched back. The creature stayed for an hour. Then it moved away, disappearing into the twisted rock formations. Grace named it Atlas. On day 12, her first seed sprouted. The growth was fast, faster than it should have been. The local minerals in the soil were doing something that earth plants liked. Grace added more seeds. She expanded her experiment. She started testing different soil mixtures. Some combinations worked better than others. She documented everything, sending reports back to the orbital station. The scientists there seemed surprised that she was still alive. She was not surprised. They had underestimated her. They had also underestimated Kethis. By day 20, Grace had filled the entire garden module with growing plants. She had begun moving experiments outside the dome, in protected containers. She was learning the weather patterns. The storms came from the west. The temperature dropped at night, but never below freezing. The creatures moved through the area in patterns. They seemed to follow routes. Some came close to her dome. None had attacked. On day 30, Grace had enough of a yield to start studying which plants the local creatures ate. She prepared samples and left them at the edge of her testing area. She watched from inside the dome. When the creatures came, they ate the plants. They did not destroy them. They did not kill them in anger. They ate them like herbivores. The briefing said these were predators. The briefing was wrong. Grace made a decision. She would not sit in the dome and wait to be rescued. She would not assume the worst about Kethis and its inhabitants. She would learn. She would test. She would understand. The council had sent her to a planet they thought was impossible. She would prove them wrong. She would prove that, with patience and observation, even the impossible could become something beautiful. Outside her dome, Kethis was not a dead world. It was a living world that no one had bothered to understand. Grace would be the first to try, and she would not stop until she had uncovered all the secrets the planet held. 6 weeks into her assignment, Grace had covered every surface of the dome with growing plants. The crops from her first experiments were ready for harvest. She cut the wheat carefully and stored it in sealed containers. She documented the growth rates, the yield, and the quality. Everything exceeded her expectations. Kethis was not trying to stop her from growing food. It was helping her. The real work was understanding the creatures. Grace moved her observation equipment to a new location, 100 meters from the dome, protected behind a natural rock formation. She set up cameras and sensors that ran on solar power. She watched the creatures that came to her area. There was Atlas, the largest one, with scales that caught the light. There was another one with a long neck and smaller frame that she called Sophia. There was a massive creature with thick skin that seemed to move slower than the others, which she named Marcus. And there was a young one, smaller than the others, that moved quickly and curiously. She named that one David. Grace spent hours each day watching them. She recorded their movements, their vocalizations, and their patterns. The creatures made sounds, deep rumbling calls that seemed to carry for great distances. When one called, others would respond. They were communicating. They had language, or at least something that served the same purpose. The creatures did not hunt other animals. Grace never saw them kill anything. What she did see was them eating plants, drinking from streams, and moving in groups. They seemed to have social structure. The larger ones protected the smaller ones. When young David wandered too far, Atlas and Sophia would move closer, as if protecting him. These were not mindless killers. These were creatures with families. One night during a bad storm, all 4 creatures moved toward the dome. Grace watched them from inside, ready to close all the barriers. But they did not attack. They stood near the dome, with their backs to the wind, sheltering in the lee of the rock formations near her structure. They were not trying to break in. They were seeking shelter from the same storm that she was hiding from. When the storm passed, they moved away. Grace began a new experiment. She prepared food from her harvested plants, cutting them into pieces and leaving them outside the dome in piles. She placed them at different distances, moving further away each day. The creatures came and ate the food. They did not fight over it. If multiple creatures came to the same pile, they shared. They would eat calmly, and when one creature had enough, it moved away to let others eat. The other researchers on the orbital station were not impressed by her work. When she sent her reports, they responded with doubt. They sent her messages suggesting that she was seeing what she wanted to see, not what was actually there. They warned her that the creatures might be luring her into false confidence before attacking. Grace ignored these messages. She was watching real behavior, real patterns. She was learning the truth. On day 45, Grace decided to change her approach. She began leaving different types of prepared food at her observation point. Some plants she cooked. Some she left raw. Some she mixed with other plants. She was learning what the creatures preferred to eat. Atlas seemed to like the cooked grain. Sophia preferred fresh leaves. Marcus would eat anything. David was curious about every type of food, tasting it carefully before eating. The creatures were individuals. They had personalities. They had preferences. They were intelligent. On day 50, something changed. Grace was at her observation point when she heard a different sound. It was not the normal rumbling communication calls. This was a warning sound, lower and more urgent. All the creatures became alert. They turned toward the west. A large storm was coming, bigger than the previous ones. Grace could see it on the horizon, dark clouds building to enormous heights. The creatures moved quickly. Instead of scattering, they gathered together. They made their way toward her dome. Grace backed away from her observation equipment and went inside. The creatures did not approach the dome. Instead, they positioned themselves around it, creating a circle. When the storm hit, it was violent. Lightning struck the ground not far away. Wind pushed hard against the dome structure. Grace made sure all the systems were secure and waited. The creatures stayed for 8 hours. They did not attack. They did not try to break in. They simply remained, surrounding her dome, their massive bodies shielding her location from the worst of the wind. When the storm finally passed, they moved away. Grace realized what had happened. The creatures were protecting her. They understood that she was small and weak compared to them. They understood that she could not survive the storm like they could. They had stayed to keep her safe. She sent a message back to the orbital station. She wrote a detailed report about the creatures' behavior, their intelligence, their social bonds, and their protection of her. The response took 3 days to arrive. "You are in danger," the message said. "Do not trust them. They may be intelligent, but that does not make them safe." Grace disagreed. She had learned something the Council had not bothered to learn. Intelligence did not make a creature dangerous. Fear made a creature dangerous. Fear came from not understanding something. Grace was beginning to understand Kethis and its inhabitants. On day 58, the first major crop was ready for full harvest. Grace worked outside the dome, cutting plants and gathering seeds. The creatures came and watched. They did not interfere. They seemed interested in what she was doing. When Grace held up a cut stalk of wheat and showed it to them, Atlas made a low rumbling sound. The other creatures responded with similar sounds. Grace placed handfuls of the wheat stalks on the ground in front of them. The creatures approached and ate carefully. They did not crush the food. They did not waste it. They ate like beings who understood the value of what they were eating. By day 60, Grace had her answer. The planet Kethis was not hostile. The soil was not poison. The creatures were not predators. The council had been wrong about everything. And Grace was no longer alone. She had 4 companions who would help her survive. She had found a home. Grace knew what she was about to do was dangerous. The orbital team would call it reckless. The council would call it a waste of resources. But she had spent the last 2 weeks studying the creatures every moment she could. She understood them now. Or at least, she understood them better than anyone else in the Galactic Council ever would. Day 70-4. She stood inside the dome and removed her full pressure suit. She kept the breather mask. She kept light armor on her arms and chest. She kept her boots. But she removed the heavy protection that covered most of her body. She looked at herself in the dome mirror. She looked small, fragile, everything a human being was when compared to the creatures outside. She opened the dome door and stepped out. The air of Kethis touched her skin. It was cold. It was strange. It was real in a way that being inside the dome never felt. Grace breathed slowly and walked toward the area where Atlas usually waited in the afternoon. Her hands were shaking. She clenched them into fists to make the shaking stop. Atlas was there. The massive creature was resting on the ground, its head up, watching the area. When it saw Grace approach without her protective suit, the creature did not move. It simply watched. Grace kept walking slowly. She had prepared food from her latest harvest, fresh-cut plants that she knew Atlas enjoyed. She held them out in her open hand. "Easy," Grace said. Her voice sounded small in the open air. "Easy, Atlas. I am bringing you food. This is good food. You like this food." The creature did not attack. It did not move toward her in a threatening way. It simply watched as she came closer. Grace was close enough now that she could hear the creature breathing. She could see the texture of its scales. She could see that its eyes were intelligent and focused on her, not looking at her like she was prey. Looking at her like she was something to understand. Grace held out the food. She did not thrust it forward. She simply held it there, her arm extended, her hand open. Atlas lowered its massive head. The creature's mouth came close to her hand. Grace's heart was beating so hard, she thought it might break her ribs. The creature could kill her in one motion. It could crush her hand. It could swallow her whole. But it did not. Instead, it gently took the food from her palm. Its mouth was precise. Its touch was controlled. It ate the plants carefully, and then it looked at Grace again. Grace felt tears on her face. She was not hurt. She was not dead. She had made contact. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you, Atlas." The next day, Grace repeated the process. This time, she felt less fear. Atlas expected her. When she came with food, the creature lowered its head and accepted it from her hands. Grace began to understand the creature on a deeper level. Atlas was patient. Atlas was intelligent. Atlas could be trusted. By day 78, Grace had successfully fed all 4 creatures by hand. Sophia was cautious and careful. Marcus was calm and steady. David was playful, sometimes nipping at her fingers in what seemed like affection. They did not see her as food or as a threat. They saw her as something they could relate to. Grace began working with the creatures on her projects. She needed to move large stones to expand her farming area. She could not do it alone. She approached Atlas with the problem, showing the creature what she needed. She made a gesture, pushing against a stone. Atlas seemed to understand. The massive creature stepped forward and pushed the stone with its head. The rock moved easily. Over the next week, Grace worked alongside the creatures. They helped her move stones, create new areas for planting, and expand her farming zones. They learned commands from her. A hand gesture meant stop. A specific whistle meant come. They responded faster with each day that passed. On day 85, Grace had a new idea. She brought music equipment outside and played it from speakers near her working area. The first song was soft, instrumental music. When the creatures heard it, they stopped moving. They came closer to the source of the sound. They stood still, listening. Grace watched them listen to the music for 20 minutes without moving. When the song ended and she started a new one, the creatures seemed to sway slightly, their massive bodies moving in subtle ways. They were not just hearing the music. They were responding to it. They were feeling it. Atlas stepped forward and lowered its head to the speaker, as if trying to understand where the sound was coming from. The creature made a low, rumbling sound that seemed to echo the melody of the music. Grace realized what was happening. Atlas was singing. The creature was trying to replicate the sounds it was hearing. Grace turned off the music and sat down on the ground. The creatures gathered around her. They did not overwhelm her. They simply sat or lay down nearby, their massive bodies creating a protective circle around her small form. Grace placed her hand on Atlas's scaled neck and felt the warmth of the creature's body. She felt the power contained in those muscles. But she also felt the gentleness. The creature could have killed her 100 times. Instead, it had chosen to protect her. It had chosen to help her. It had chosen to understand her. In that moment, Grace understood something crucial. The Galactic Council had looked at these creatures and seen monsters because they were big and powerful and different. But the Council had never bothered to truly see them. Grace had taken the time. She had observed. She had tried to understand. And in understanding, she had discovered that intelligence was not about size or power. Intelligence was about the ability to choose compassion. Intelligence was about the capacity to understand another being and treat it with care. The creatures of Kethis were intelligent in ways that advanced technology could never measure. They were intelligent in the way that mattered most. They knew how to be kind. By day 100, Grace had harvested her first full crops 3 times over. The soil was becoming richer with each cycle. She had identified nutrients from the planet's bedrock that seemed to enhance plant growth. She had also discovered that the creatures played a crucial role in this process. Their waste enriched the soil in ways that accelerated plant development. It was as if the entire planet was designed for growth, for abundance, for life to flourish. Grace made a decision. The dome was no longer enough. She needed more space. She needed to expand her operation beyond the small habitat module she had been living in. She needed to build something larger, something that could house more equipment, more crops, and eventually, more people. With the help of the creatures. Grace began construction on day 102. The location she chose was on higher ground, a natural plateau that was surrounded by rock formations that provided protection from the worst of the storms. The creatures helped her move materials from her original landing site. They carried heavy equipment that would have taken her months to move alone. Atlas could carry loads on its back that a human truck could not move. Sophia used her long neck to place equipment precisely where it needed to go. Marcus simply pushed and carried with steady, powerful movements. Grace designed the new settlement carefully. She wanted it to work with the landscape, not against it. The structures would be built partially into the rock formations. They would use the natural protection of the terrain. The open areas would be divided into farming zones, each one specifically designed for different types of crops. There would be areas for the creatures to rest and shelter. There would be spaces for water collection and storage. It would be a home for both humans and the creatures of Kethis. Construction took 3 weeks. Grace worked alongside the creatures every day. She would plan, design, and direct. The creatures would build. They learned to handle materials carefully. They learned to follow her hand signals and voice commands. They became skilled workers, not just strong helpers. They understood the purpose of what they were building. They were building a community. By day 125, the first permanent structures were complete. Grace named the settlement New Eden. She planted trees and flowers around the structures, creating green spaces among the rock and metal. She expanded her farming operations, creating gardens that spread across the plateau in patterns that maximize sunlight and water efficiency. The creatures helped her plant seeds. They learned to avoid the growing plants. They learned to water the gardens by carrying water in containers. Young David was the most enthusiastic helper. The creature would follow Grace around constantly, imitating her movements, trying to understand her work. When Grace planted seeds, David would watch intently. When she explained what she was doing by making gestures and sounds, David would try to replicate her actions. The young creature was learning. It was absorbing knowledge. It was becoming more capable with each passing day. One afternoon, Grace discovered something remarkable. She had left a group of tools in the garden while she worked on expanding a planting area. When she returned, the tools were arranged in a neat pile, away from the growing plants. The creatures had done it. Sophia had gathered the tools and moved them to a safe location, away from where they could damage the crops. The creature had recognized the purpose of the tools and had taken action to protect them. Grace stood looking at that pile of tools and realized something profound. The creatures were not just helping her with her work. They were thinking about the work. They were making decisions. They understood cause and effect. They understood that tools had value. They understood that plants needed protection. They were partners, not just workers. Grace began teaching them more deliberately. She showed them how to test soil quality by smell and touch. She showed them how to recognize when crops were ready for harvest. She showed them the rhythm of planting and growing and reaping. The creatures learned. They retained information. They applied what they learned to new situations. The communication between Grace and the creatures became more sophisticated. She learned some of their vocalizations. She could distinguish between Atlas's calls and Sophia's calls. She could hear when Marcus was warning about approaching storms. She could hear David's curious chirps when the young creature wanted to explore something new. They were teaching her their language as much as she was teaching them to understand hers. On day 140, Grace sent a detailed report to the orbital station. She included images of New Eden, the farming operations, and the creatures working alongside her. She sent technical data about the crops, the soil improvements, and the planetary systems. But most importantly, she sent evidence that the creatures were intelligent, capable, and willing partners in building something new. The response from the council took 5 days to arrive. The message was brief and skeptical. We are sending an observation team to verify your claims. Do not do anything dangerous. Do not make unnecessary contact with the creatures. Follow protocol. Grace read the message and smiled. Protocol? They were still thinking in terms of fear and distance and careful separation. They had not learned what she had learned. They could not understand until they saw it with their own eyes. By day 150, more crops were thriving than Grace had ever imagined possible. Her original projections had been too conservative. The yield was tripling with each growing cycle. The creatures had become so integrated into the farming process that Grace could not imagine doing the work without them. Atlas knew which areas needed tending. Sophia could assess plant health with remarkable accuracy. Marcus worked tirelessly, never complaining, never tiring. David was becoming increasingly skilled, showing signs that one day it might be as capable as the older creatures. Grace stood on a high point of the plateau and looked out across New Eden. The gardens were growing. The structures were solid and functional. The creatures were resting nearby, their massive forms seeming peaceful and content. The planet that had been called Unlivable was thriving. It was becoming beautiful. She was no longer a human alone on a hostile world. She was the founder of something new. She was the first human to truly work with an alien species as equals. She was building a future that no one in the Galactic Council had imagined possible. The observation team arrived on day 178. 3 council representatives came down from the orbital station. They wore heavy protective suits, carried advanced weapons, and moved with extreme caution. They looked at Grace like she was a ghost, someone they had not expected to find alive. "This is incredible," one of them said, but Grace heard the doubt in her voice. "Show us your settlement. Show us your data." Grace led them through New Eden. She showed them the farming areas, the crop yields, the storage facilities. She showed them the soil analysis that proved the planet was not toxic. She showed them the water purification systems. She documented everything. The council representatives took readings, ran their own tests, and verified her numbers. Everything was correct. Everything exceeded expectations, but they still looked skeptical. "Where are the creatures?" one of them asked. Grace smiled. "Come with me." She walked out to the main open area of the settlement where she always met with the creatures in the afternoons. She whistled, a sound that Atlas had learned to recognize. The 4 creatures came immediately. They moved slowly and carefully, obviously aware that the visitors were present. The creatures did not look threatening. They looked like they understood the gravity of the moment. Atlas approached Grace and lowered its head. Grace placed her hand on the creature's neck and looked directly at the council representatives. "This is Atlas. This creature has protected me, helped me build this settlement, and worked with me every single day for the past 4 months. These creatures are not monsters. They are intelligent beings with feelings, with preferences, with the ability to think and plan and care." One of the council representatives stepped back. The other 2 moved closer, taking readings with their equipment. They scanned the creatures. They took tissue samples. They asked Grace dozens of questions. And slowly, their expressions began to change. "The neural complexity is extraordinary," one of them said, looking at their instrument readings. "The brain-to-body ratio is comparable to dolphins on Earth. These creatures are genuinely intelligent. They have complex social structures," another added. "They show signs of emotional bonding, of communication using multiple modalities. This is unprecedented." Grace nodded. "They showed me all of that weeks ago. You just needed the equipment to verify it." David approached one of the council representatives and made a curious sound. The representative froze. David was not being aggressive. The young creature was simply curious about this newcomer. David sniffed the representative's suit and then made a soft chirping sound. Sophia came over and gently nudged the representative with her long neck, as if saying hello. The council representative did not move. For the first time, Grace saw something like wonder on their face. "They are greeting us," the representative said quietly. Over the next 2 days, the council team observed everything. They watched Grace work with the creatures. They watched the creatures perform tasks, follow commands, and show evidence of making decisions. They ran every test they could conceive of, and every test confirmed what Grace had known for months. The creatures of Cephas were intelligent. The planet was habitable. The entire initial assessment had been completely wrong. On day 180, the council representatives held a private meeting. Grace waited outside New Eden while they discussed what they had learned. When they emerged, the lead representative approached her with a formal expression. The Galactic Council is prepared to declare planet Kethis suitable for settlement and development. We are prepared to acknowledge you as the first planetary architect of Kethis. We are prepared to allocate resources, personnel, and support for further expansion of human settlement here. We are also prepared to formally recognize the creatures as an intelligent species with full rights. Grace nodded. She had expected nothing less. But the recognition still meant something. It meant that the Council was beginning to understand. It meant that humanity's future in the galaxy was changing. The representatives made preparations for their departure. As their shuttle was being loaded, the lead representative approached Grace one final time. "I do not understand how you knew the creatures would be peaceful," the representative said. "The initial assessment was from 3 different advanced species. How did you see something they missed?" Grace looked at Atlas, who was resting nearby with the other creatures. She thought about all the hours she had spent observing, learning, trying to understand. "I did not assume they were monsters just because they looked different," Grace said. "I did not judge them by appearance or by size. I took time to understand them. That is what humans do when we are not afraid. We try to understand. We look for commonality instead of difference." The representative seemed to consider this. Then the Council team left. The shuttle lifted off and disappeared into the sky. Grace stood with Atlas at her side, looking across New Eden. The gardens were expanding. New structures were being built. The creatures moved through the settlement with purpose and contentment. She thought about the message she had sent to the stars. The message that would tell all the advanced species in the Galactic Council that humans were capable of something they were not. Humans could see potential where others saw only danger. Humans could form genuine partnerships with alien life. Humans could transform impossible situations through determination and compassion. Other human settlers would come. More equipment would arrive. New Eden would grow. But Grace would always remember this time, when she was alone on Kethis with 4 creatures who became her friends, her helpers, her family. She would always remember the moment when she realized that true strength was not about weapons or advanced technology. True strength was about understanding. True strength was about choosing kindness. Atlas made a low, rumbling sound. The other creatures responded with their own vocalizations. They were singing together, creating a harmony that echoed across the plateau. Grace stood in the center of that circle and felt something she had not felt in many years. She felt like she was home. The planet that had been called unlivable was not unlivable at all. It was full of life. It was full of possibility. It was full of potential for humans and the creatures of Kethis to build something together. Something better than anyone had imagined. Something that would change how the galaxy understood humanity. And its place among the stars, Grace looked up at the sky where the council ship had disappeared and smiled. She had found her purpose. She had found her place. And she had proven that when humans chose compassion over fear, when they chose understanding over judgment, they could accomplish things that even the most advanced species in the galaxy could not. The future was waiting, and it belonged to those brave enough to see it.